The first thing I heard wasn't the hymn, it was my mother's voice, sharp and cutting, slicing through the quiet like a blade. "Even God gave up on her," she said, loud enough for everyone around to hear. The pastor, standing just feet away at the pulpit, chuckled. Half the congregation followed, their laughter rolling through the pews like a wave I couldn't outrun. I sat there, frozen, my hands gripping the worn Bible on my lap, heart pounding against my ribs like it was trying to escape. Nobody moved to comfort me. Nobody even looked uncomfortable. In that moment, I was truly, utterly alone, in a place that had once been my sanctuary. On my left, my mother, Lillian Collins, looked on with a smile that barely masked her satisfaction. A woman who had raised me with iron expectations and little mercy, she thrived on my humiliation. At the pulpit, Pastor Jim Hadley, a man my family once revered, pretended not to notice the cruelty he had just endorsed. Around me, the faces blurred. Some turning away, some pretending to be lost in thought, others smiling awkwardly, complicit in their silence. I shrank deeper into the wooden pew, every fiber in my body screaming to disappear. That's when I felt a hand brush my shoulder. I turned to see Mr. Samuel Brooks, the choir director, one of the few faces not twisted with judgment. Without a word, he pressed a sealed card into my hand, squeezed my fingers gently, and walked away. I stared down at it, heart hammering harder now, unsure if I even had the strength to open it. But somewhere deep inside, something stirred. Not anger, not yet. Something stronger, something waiting to be awakened. And when I finally opened that card, everything in my life changed. The church had once been my safe place. As a little girl, I used to sit cross-legged on the front pew, humming along with the choir, swinging my patent leather shoes under the seat, feeling like I belonged to something bigger than myself. Back then, people smiled at me when I passed them. They called me Little Light because I was always laughing, always asking questions, always believing. That girl felt like a lifetime ago. Now, as a 27-year-old woman, I sat 3 rows back from the pulpit, stiff and silent in a pew polished smooth by generations of worshipers. The wooden bench was hard beneath me, but the stares and whispers digging into my back were harder. I kept my head down, pretending to read the bulletin tucked inside my worn Bible, even though the words swam uselessly before my eyes. Outside, sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, throwing colorful patterns across the congregation. Red, blue, gold. Inside me, everything was gray, muted, hollow. My return to this small town had been a quiet one. After my marriage fell apart, I didn't have many choices left. The city was too expensive. My friends had faded away during the long, bitter years when I tried to keep my crumbling relationship a secret. The only place left was the one I had sworn I would never come back to, Ridgefield Baptist Church, the cornerstone of our little Georgian town and the center of my childhood world. Coming back hadn't been a choice made with hope. It was surrender. I lived now in the attic room of my mother's old farmhouse, the same creaky house where I'd spent sleepless teenage nights, crying into my pillow, wishing for an escape. Some nights, lying under the slanted ceiling, I still felt 16 years old, trapped in the same cage of disapproval and silent resentment. But during the day, I tried to act grateful, tried to believe I could survive the cold glances, the clipped conversations, the way my mother's mouth tightened whenever she looked at me. Lillian Collins wasn't an evil woman, not by the world's standards anyway. She never screamed, she never hit. She just wielded her disappointment like a weapon, cutting deeper than any hand ever could. In public, she draped her cruelty in church language, prayers for my wayward heart, sad smiles about my struggles, murmured pity to anyone who would listen. And people listened, especially Pastor Jim Hadley, a man who had known me since I was a child, but who now seemed eager to distance himself from the fallen daughter of one of his most influential parishioners. It wasn't personal, it was survival. The church was a place of unspoken politics, and my mother's approval carried weight. Standing up for me would have been a risk, and Pastor Hadley wasn't the kind of man who took risks. He took the easy path. He laughed when my mother mocked me. and so did half the people sitting around me. As the morning service trudged on, hymns sung half-heartedly, announcements droning from the pulpit, I felt the distance between me and this community stretch into a yawning, unbridgeable chasm. These were the people I once thought of as family. These were the pews I once knelt beside, the stained glass saints I once whispered prayers to. And yet here I sat, a ghost among the living, unacknowledged except in mockery. The smell of old wood and floor polish filled my nostrils. The choir's music swelled, but it couldn't drown out the hollow ache in my chest. I knew the service schedule by heart. 2 more hymns, the offering, a sermon about forgiveness, ironically enough, and then final prayers. I could survive that long. I just had to disappear inside myself a little longer. I slid my Bible closed and tucked it under my arm, planning my exit before the crowd could trap me in fake smiles and brittle small talk. Maybe I could slip out during the last hymn, hide in the restroom until the parking lot cleared. Maybe I could get home before my mother had a chance to dissect every second of my failure to hold myself with dignity. But fate, or perhaps something greater, had other plans for me, and the first sign came quietly, like a whisper against the roar of shame. A hand brushing my shoulder, a card pressed into my hand, a look from Mr. Samuel Brooks, the choir director, the only person who had ever treated me like I still mattered. I didn't know it yet, but the weight of that little envelope would outweigh every bitter word that had ever been thrown at me. And by the time I stood up to open it, I wouldn't just be claiming a piece of paper. I would be reclaiming myself. The final hymn faded into an awkward hush, the organist's last notes hanging heavy in the air. Pastor Hadley cleared his throat and adjusted his microphone, shuffling his notes with an easy smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "We are so blessed," he said, looking out over the congregation, "to gather here week after week in love and grace. Let's open the floor for testimonies. Anyone feeling led by the Spirit to share today?" A few murmurs. Some shifting in seats. No one moved. My mother, of course, could never resist a stage. Lillian Collins rose to her feet, a slow, deliberate movement that commanded attention without seeming to demand it. She pressed a delicate hand against her chest, the picture of modesty and concern, and looked directly at Pastor Hadley, who smiled warmly at her as if expecting a few gracious words about blessings or gratitude. Instead, she turned, sweeping her gaze over the congregation until it landed right on me. Her voice was smooth, almost tender. "I just want to remind everyone to pray especially hard for those of us who struggle to find their way. Sometimes," she paused, letting the room lean in, "even God gives up." A few uncomfortable chuckles broke out. Pastor Hadley gave a little laugh, probably thinking she was just being colorful, a harmless joke among family. But I felt it like a slap. Eyes slid toward me, some with pity, others amusement, a few, worse yet, with open judgment. My stomach twisted so violently I thought I might throw up right there on the polished wooden floor. I stared down at my hands, willing myself to stay small, invisible. Maybe if I didn't react, the moment would pass. Maybe if I stayed still enough, I could disappear altogether. But the moment didn't pass. It grew. Like wildfire licking through dry brush, laughter spread through the pews. Whispered jokes, smirks hidden behind hymnals, even a few gasps that sounded more entertained than appalled. I wasn't just humiliated, I was betrayed. Publicly, completely, and worst of all, by my own mother, the woman who should have been my fiercest defender. The walls seemed to close in around me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The world had shrunk to a point where all that existed was the sting of humiliation and the roaring silence of people who once claimed to love me. Even as Pastor Hadley chuckled and moved on with the service, reading the next passage from Corinthians about forgiveness and patience, the damage was already done. No verse, no prayer, could erase the image now burned into everyone's minds. Aria Collins, the prodigal daughter even God had supposedly abandoned. And sitting among them, I realized something bone deep. It wasn't just my mother who had given up on me. It was all of them. These people I had once trusted to guide me, protect me, lift me up. They had chosen to tear me down when I was at my lowest. Not one voice had spoken up in my defense. Not one person had stood. Even as the pastor's voice droned on, I could feel the fissure crack wider inside me, separating who I had been from who I was about to become. I clutched the card Mr. Brooks had slipped me, holding it so tightly the paper crumpled in my hand. It felt absurd. A piece of paper against an entire room of scorn. But something about the gravity in his eyes when he handed it to me. It made me believe for the first time in a long while that maybe I wasn't as alone as I felt. I squeezed my eyes shut and prayed. Not the desperate, broken prayers I had whispered at night, begging for rescue. Not the hollow words I mouthed out of habit. A real prayer, simple, raw. Give me the strength to survive this. As the service stumbled forward, my mind raced. I could get up now, walk out, never come back, let them win. Or I could stay. I could read the card. I could find out why Mr. Brooks, a man with nothing to gain and plenty to lose, had risked slipping me something during service. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was everything. I unfolded the crumpled card slowly, heart hammering against my ribs, feeling like the walls of the church were either about to crush me or break wide open. Inside, in careful handwriting, were words that would change everything. And for the first time in years, I felt something I had almost forgotten existed: hope. My fingers trembled as I smoothed out the card, the delicate paper crinkling under my touch. For a moment, all I could do was stare at the neat, careful handwriting as the words blurred before me, my vision swimming with emotion I couldn't yet name. He believed in you until his very last breath. You were never forgotten. You were chosen. The church belongs to you now. Stand tall. There, paper-clipped behind the card, was a legal document, stamped, notarized, and unmistakably real. My grandfather, Thomas Collins, the man who had once lifted me onto his shoulders during Christmas cantatas, who taught me to read from his weathered old Bible, had left me ownership of the Ridgefield Baptist Church. Not my mother, not the pastor, not the church board, me. I blinked rapidly, my heart galloping as the reality of it crashed over me. The pulpit, the pews, the stained glass windows casting fractured light across the floor, they were mine now. Entrusted to me by the only man who had seen past my mistakes, my shame, and my bruised spirit. He hadn't given up. He had prepared for this moment. And now, the choice was mine. I could slip the card into my Bible, tuck my tail between my legs, and sneak out like they all expected. Let the laughter, the judgment, the betrayal follow me home like a ghost. Or I could rise. I could plant my feet firmly on the ground my grandfather once walked and face them. All of them, with the truth. I could reclaim not just the church, but my voice. Every instinct inside me screamed to run. For years, survival had meant shrinking myself down, swallowing my pain, staying invisible. But invisible hadn't saved me. Invisible had only made it easier for them to wound me. Invisible was not what my grandfather had seen when he wrote those words. Invisible was not who I was meant to be. The last hymn ended, and Pastor Hadley cleared his throat to dismiss the congregation with the final prayer. People were already gathering their purses and bulletins, shifting impatiently toward the aisle. Soon the sanctuary would erupt into chatter and noise, and my chance would be lost. I stood. Not dramatically, not loudly, just firmly, like a tree finally deciding it would no longer bend to every gust of wind. Heads turned. A few gasps floated up from the nearest pews. Whispers rippled across the sanctuary like tiny earthquakes. I didn't wait for permission. I didn't seek the pastor's nod. I walked down the center aisle, slow, steady, until I stood at the front, just a few feet from the pulpit, where Pastor Hadley hovered, blinking in confusion. Lillian's face, out of the corner of my eye, was a mask of horror and fury barely contained. Good. I turned to face the congregation. My voice, when I spoke, was stronger than I felt. "I have something to say." The pastor opened his mouth, maybe to object, but I held up the card. Not to him, but to everyone. The entire church. The people who had laughed, who had looked away, who had joined in the shaming, leaned in, hungry for a spectacle. I gave them something else entirely. "My grandfather believed in second chances," I said, steady now. "He believed that faith wasn't measured by appearances, or by mistakes, or by how many people you could impress on a Sunday morning." A few people shifted uncomfortably. A woman in the third pew bit her lip. Someone near the back coughed awkwardly. I swallowed, my throat tight but my spirit burning brighter by the second. He left this church to me, not to the board, not to the highest tither, not to the loudest voice. I let that sink in. The silence deepened, charged with something new, not mockery now, but uncertainty. Fear even. I set the card gently on the pulpit, right next to the open Bible, where the words of love and faith my grandfather had written could not be ignored. "For anyone who feels small here," I said quietly, but clearly, "for anyone who's been told they are unworthy, unloved, or abandoned, this is your place now too." I stepped back, my heart pounding but my chin lifted high. The congregation sat frozen, staring at me. Pastor Hadley fumbled with his papers. Lillian's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, no words coming out. For the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. I didn't feel broken. I felt seen. I felt whole. And I wasn't going to run anymore. The room stayed frozen for a beat longer. A thick, heavy silence stretching across the sanctuary like a rope pulled too tight. I stood there, my heart hammering against my ribs, my palms still damp with nerves, but I didn't shrink back. Not this time. For a moment, no one moved. No one dared to. I could see it on their faces, the congregation grappling with the reality of what I had just said. The girl they had whispered about, pitied, mocked, was now the rightful owner of the very church where they sat. Their sanctuary was no longer under the control of the people they had aligned themselves with. It was mine. Pastor Hadley shuffled his papers, clearing his throat into the microphone, desperate to regain control of the narrative. "Well, now, that's certainly a development," he said with a forced chuckle, attempting to brush the moment aside with the same easy charm he always used. But the congregation wasn't laughing anymore. I watched Lillian's face, my mother's carefully constructed mask, crack. Her lips tightened into a thin line. Her nostrils flared as she fought for composure, her hands twisting the hem of her designer cardigan. For someone who had built her entire life on control, on image, this was an unthinkable humiliation. She stood abruptly, her heels clicking sharply against the tile as she stepped into the aisle. "Surely there must be some mistake," she said, her voice brittle, slicing through the tension like a blade. "My father would never have—" I turned to face her, the card still resting on the pulpit between us like a silent witness. "He did," I said, my voice steady, "and it's legal, certified, final." Mr. Brooks, Samuel, rose from his seat near the choir loft. For the first time that morning, his voice filled the space with quiet authority. "I was there," he said, looking at the crowd, not just at my mother. "I sat with Thomas Collins while he drafted the papers. He was of sound mind. He knew exactly what he was doing. He chose Aria, and he asked me to make sure this document reached her when she was ready." The room shifted. Murmurs began to swell, uncertain, questioning, fearful. People glanced at each other, weighing allegiances they had once thought secure. If Mr. Brooks was willing to stake his reputation on this, it wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was truth, and truth was far more dangerous than gossip. I watched my mother falter, her confidence slipping as the foundation beneath her crumbled. She opened her mouth again, then closed it. The years of unspoken pain between us crackled in the space, raw and exposed. But I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. This wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming the place where my heart had first learned faith and giving it back to the people who needed it most. I turned once more to the congregation, seeing them clearly for the first time. Mrs. Turner, who had once taught my Sunday school class, now looking shamefaced. Mr. Lawson, who had laughed the loudest earlier, now shifting uncomfortably. Even the teenage choir members, wide-eyed, uncertain, watching history being rewritten before their eyes. This church was built on forgiveness, I said quietly. And real forgiveness doesn't come with conditions. It doesn't laugh at the broken. It doesn't mock the wounded. I looked directly at Pastor Hadley, who flinched under my gaze. This place will be a refuge again, I promised, for everyone. A rustle of movement caught my eye. One by one, a few people stood. Not everyone, but enough to see. A few heads bowed. Some wiped their eyes. Mr. Brooks stepped down from the choir loft and stood beside me. Not in front of me, not for me, but with me. His presence was quiet but powerful, a silent affirmation that I wasn't standing alone. The final notes of the abandoned hymn still hung in the air, but something new filled the room now. Not judgment, not shame, not fear, hope. Real, tangible, undeniable hope. I didn't smile, I didn't cry, I just breathed. For the first time in years, I took a deep, full breath and stood in the light without shrinking away. The moment wasn't flashy, it wasn't dramatic. It was simple, pure, and profoundly, beautifully mine. The sanctuary emptied slowly after that. Not with the usual noisy chatter and handshakes, but in slow, thoughtful trickles. Some people hurried past me, heads down, pretending they had somewhere urgent to be. Others paused awkwardly, as if searching for the right words, but finding none. A few, only a few, offered small, tight smiles, nods that said more than words ever could. It wasn't a parade of apologies. It wasn't a flood of sudden acceptance. It was silence. But it was a different kind of silence now. Not the heavy, condemning silence that had crushed me moments before. This silence was heavy with possibility. I stayed where I was, standing in the front of the church long after the last hymn books were stacked and the last footsteps faded. The sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting soft reds, blues, and yellows over the pulpit. It felt like a blessing. It felt like a beginning. Mr. Brooks lingered nearby, giving me space but remaining close, a quiet pillar of support. I was grateful for his presence, not because I needed him to shield me, but because it reminded me that belief, the real kind, still existed. Eventually, I sat down in the front pew and unfolded the legal papers once again, running my fingers over my grandfather's signature, Thomas Collins. He'd always been a quiet man, a steady one, with strong hands and a softer heart than he ever let the world see. I thought back to the days he had spent with me in this very building, teaching me to sing from the hymnal, showing me how to polish the brass rails until they gleamed, letting me ring the bell with both hands and a whoop of delight. He never said much, but he didn't need to. I had always known he loved me. I just hadn't realized how deeply, or how far into the future his love would carry me. The decision he had made wasn't just about land or property. It was a declaration. An act of faith in me when the rest of the world had turned away. He hadn't left me the church because I was perfect. He left it to me because he believed that brokenness wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of something stronger. That night, sitting cross-legged on my narrow bed in my mother's attic, I laid the documents out in front of me and thought about what came next. I could keep things as they were, let the old patterns linger, let the same people hold on to their smallness and their cruelty. Or I could change it, really change it. I decided right then that Ridgefield Baptist Church wouldn't just be another Sunday stop on the way to brunch. It would be a place for the weary, the shamed, the hurting, the ones like me who had been laughed at, whispered about, and cast aside. I wasn't naive. I knew it wouldn't be easy. Some people would leave. Some would fight me. Maybe even smear my name worse than before, but for the first time, that thought didn't terrify me. It emboldened me, because the truth was I had survived the worst they had to offer already. The laughter, the betrayal, the isolation, and I was still standing. More than that, I was ready to build something better. Weeks later, when the new sign went up over the church doors, it didn't bear a flashy slogan or a list of Sunday events. It simply read, "You are welcome here." The first service under my leadership wasn't packed, but it was real. A single mother slipped into the back row, her toddler in tow. An older man I recognized from town, usually too shy to speak above a whisper, stood and read a passage from Psalms with trembling hands. A teenager with purple hair, someone who would have been turned away before, played the keyboard in the choir loft, smiling through tears. They came because they needed hope, and they stayed because they found it. Every Sunday after that, the pews filled a little more. Not with the proud and the powerful, but with the weary and the willing. I didn't do it alone, but I had been the first to stand. And sometimes, that's all it takes. Now, when I walk through the front doors of Ridgefield Baptist, I no longer feel invisible. I don't feel judged. I feel free. I still see the stained glass windows, but now I see myself in their fractured, colorful light. Beautiful because of the broken pieces, not in spite of them. And every time I hear the old bell ring across the town square, I smile. Because I know, deep in my bones, that the girl they once laughed at wasn't lost. She was just waiting for the right moment to rise,